Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Fishing for Answers. Today, I'm here with Lester Godsey, the CISO of Arizona State University. Lester, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua, for having me. And so, as you mentioned, I'm the CISO for Arizona State University. I haven't quite hit my 2 month mark yet, so I'm still relatively new to the organization, but things have a funny way of developing. And so, I started my IT career over 27 years ago, actually at ASU. And so, um, I was wrapping up my music degree at the time. And so, I got my first student worker position in an IT help desk environment. And so, I worked for ASU between 94 and 2003. And then I left ASU, took a 21-year break working for local government, primarily here in the state of Arizona. So, town of Queen Creek, the city of Mesa. And my previous stint was as the CISO for Maricopa County, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of in the news, if nothing else, if for no other reason, for elections. And so,
Yeah, that
um,
county does like to make the news every election, just about.
I, I would dare say they don't like it. It just happens to them. So, um,
Fair,
but uh,
fair.
and then interestingly enough, I've now found my way back full circle at Arizona State University as their CISO. So it's been quite the journey from a professional perspective. But I'm happy to be here.
Well, congratulations. I'm sure the new job is exciting and fun and a new challenge. Anything unique to education that maybe is stands out as being very different than the public sector space that you were in before?
Um, there are some unique aspects to it, and so especially given ASU, given its size and breadth, and so um, by enrollment, I believe we're the largest public university in the country, and so, and I know that number kind of shifts or dips up and down, but in particular, ASU, given the size and breadth of the organization as a whole, that in itself is part of the big challenge, right? And so, from a cybersecurity perspective, obviously things such as artificial intelligence, AI, AI is a big part of ASU, and ASU, from my perspective, is leading the way, especially at higher ed, in terms of adoption and moving towards AI and embracing that for our charter and purpose here at Arizona State University. And then also, just given the sheer amount of research that ASU does as an organization, that has definitely been a difference than my previous stints, where data security was always important, but not in the context of like intellectual property or bespoke developed sort of data, if you will. And so that's been a marked difference between my previous stints and my current role here at ASU.
Okay. Well, a little bit off subject, but you said you're doing a lot in AI in terms of adaptation and stuff like that. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Love to hear it.
Yeah, and I would encourage listeners to go to ai.asu.edu for more specific information. But uh, some organizations, including local government for that matter, have taken a stance of where they're trying to put pump the brakes, so to speak, with regards to adoption of AI technology, and understandably, in some instances, just because some organizations may not be equipped from a security perspective to address that. ASU has fully embraced that. There's a formal partnership between Arizona State University and OpenAI, for example.
Oh, wow.
Um, in terms of the ASU supports, at last count, to my knowledge, it seems like that number is always changing, has adopted over 40 large language models for internal purposes. And so, really, ASU has jumped in with both feet along those lines. And they've done some very creative sorts of things with regards to engaging the ASU community as a whole, finding use cases from an instruction perspective, research, administrative, operational perspective. And so, really, it runs the gamut along those lines. So ASU, from my perspective, is really leading the way, at least from a higher education perspective.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And AI is the future. I mean, it's getting smarter every day. It's already, depending on the measurement, getting close to AGI. With the new model from OpenAI, we just saw that they hit the AGI benchmark, and then they changed the goalpost, if you will, or moved the goalpost, and said, "Well, we need to create a new test," basically. Um, but it gets smarter every day, and there's all kinds of very fascinating stuff coming up about it. So it's not going anywhere, and I think that's very wise as a university is to embrace it because you're not going to be able to get rid of it if you tell people they can't use it. They're just going to use it on their own devices. So it's much better to get them and empower them to have some sort of tool to use so that they can, utilize and start taking advantage of AI in their day to day job than have them go out and, well, use God knows what tool
Right.
that's probably free from whatever site. I mean, there's some really great free, open source, like, or not, maybe not open source, but like free open LLMs out there, that are like, that's no big deal. They're just, developed in China, hosted in China.
Sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
and so, I mean, we got to think about those things. And whether it's China or whether it's the United States, you still don't want your information being used to train that model.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, to that, AI brings a lot of security awareness challenges. What are you thinking about and what are you training on when it comes to that?
Yeah. So I think whether you're talking about AI, whether you're talking about cloud security, or any kind of the accelerated adoption of technology as a whole, I think one of the common underlying themes that I speak about quite a bit is uh, the adoption of those technologies just exacerbate or highlight fundamental issues that have plagued our industry for decades. And so, a great example of that is data security, but also things like understanding and treating data as an asset maybe is the best way of articulating it. And so um, how many organizations have their arms around what data they have, how many copies of it do they have, what's the sensitivity of that data, how is that data leveraged from a business perspective. And so from a pure cybersecurity point of view, our goal or objective is to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of services, in this instance, data, right? And
Yeah.
so then when you layer AI on top of that, um, how are you ensuring that the data that's being fed to the models is appropriate for the audience that's intended, who has access to that model, or the output therein. What about organizations that, from a privacy perspective, obfuscate certain sensitive information? Now, with the advent of AI, now you have to worry about the identification sorts of activities, right? And so, a great example of that is from a previous job that I had, where it's very common with local government to have open data portals and to share freely with the constituents data. And
Yeah.
so one organization I worked for would post 911 call data. And so, but one of the things that they used to do is they would obfuscate the origin of 911 calls and round up to the nearest 100 blocks. So your street address, they'd round it up so it wasn't the exact address. And the reason why they did that is because they wanted to protect their citizens from, maybe their neighbors finding out that they had to call 911 for like a domestic violence call or some other sort of request, right?
Yeah.
Now, with AI models, and if they have access to that open data, and this idea of re-identifying the information is a real potential concern, right? And so, but this is all fundamentally goes back to how organizations, whether they treat data as an asset or not, and do they have the appropriate controls in place. And so I think we're seeing that with AI, we're seeing that with cloud technology. So asset management in relation to the cloud, for example. So do you know what assets do you have in the cloud? Well,
Yeah.
it fundamentally goes back to asset management. How well do you do asset management to begin with, right? And so kind of lipstick, new lipstick on the same pig, so to speak. So
One thing that I'm still interested in is role-based access controls around large language models. I mean, we see them deployed in all of these massive organizations to everybody at every layer of the organization. How do you make sure that the brand new temp that was hired this morning doesn't have the same level of access as the CEO? And so I mean, I think that's one of those things that I look at as well. I really feel like AI in general has not kept up with cybersecurity, and it's a technology moving at a pace that means we're going to have to be dealing with security and cleanup from this probably for the next decade. It wouldn't surprise me.
I think a lot of organizations, to your point, Joshua, yeah, that's a challenge that they face. I know one of the unique things about ASU is they've developed their own uh, custom AI platform and environment, frankly. And so, one of the nice things about that is, from a cybersecurity perspective, is that they've architected the solution with security and privacy in mind. And so, at least our environments that we're operating in have garden walls, so to speak. They don't connect out to the bigger public internet, if you will. And so we have a lot of foundational security controls by design already in place. And so we just need to continue building upon that from a cybersecurity perspective. But to your point, a lot of other organizations who don't have those resources and are consuming third-party AI solutions out there, definitely there's a lot of questions to be raised in terms of utilization of information. One of the things I would say is, it's been my experience over the last number of years, vendors are less pushing about who owns data. So, like, if you're using a SaaS service, whether it's a third-party AI model or just a software as a service, um, the vendors are less prone to push back and say, no, that data belongs to us, and they're more akin to acquiescing ownership to the customer. But one of the things that they're less inclined to do is articulate how they use their customers' data for their own purposes. And so that's where it starts to get gray, right? And so that's something, whether we're talking about AI or just, SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS type of services, I would encourage people to read the fine print, so to speak, and ask those questions as to, how are you using our data? Are you benefiting from a commercial perspective? Are you anonymizing that information but then subsequently selling it, or whatever the case is? So there's a lot of questions, and the technology is moving so fast, it's hard to keep up at times.
Oh, it absolutely is hard to keep up. I mean, particularly from a security perspective. So you don't want anyone to use any tools but the approved ones. Well, there's a new tool every day. How do you keep up with the pace to make sure that those are blocked, that you can't access those from within the network? So, even just the simple stuff is still a massive moving target, for sure. Now, what kind of or have you seen any AI driven attacks? I ask because I see a lot of phishing that has AI all over it. Maybe not directly AI, 100%, but it sure looks like it's AI. Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah, and so the short answer is absolutely. Um, and frankly, the best examples that come to mind are from my previous job at Maricopa County. And so to your point, Joshua, if people haven't seen AI being leveraged for, like, enhanced phishing emails, then I suspect they're not paying attention. And so, the traditional sort of Nigerian prince type of thing is no longer a thing, right? AI is definitely crafting these messages, higher caliber. They're in the native language of the intended target, and it reads it that way, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the more interesting use cases that I've personally seen and have experienced are the use of AI for deepfakes. And so, um, when I during the 2020 election cycle, we saw a bunch of deepfakes at Maricopa County, but honestly, the
Wow.
quality and the caliber were such that it is a little laughable, right? It wasn't super plausible or
Well, yeah, that
believable.
was back in 2020, the technology was still barely there, so you must have
Yeah.
been one of the first to see that anywhere,
Well, for local government in particular, I don't know if we were the absolute first, but we're definitely on the unwanted cutting edge, if you will. But the interesting thing about 2024 was we also saw our fair share of deepfakes, and nobody was laughing. And so the technology had improved significantly along those lines. One thing that I think maybe is not as common a use case is the use of AI for strategic planning. And what I mean by that is I went to DEF CON 2 years ago in Las Vegas. I don't remember the university at the time, but there was a bunch of faculty there that had their own custom large language model. And and so this was in the misinformation village, I believe it was. And so we had basically used their private model to help create, and all of us were creating our own misdis and malinformation campaign and using AI to basically outline what the steps would be in order to enact and execute an attack along those lines.
and that's a
And
great thing about DEF CON, you get to do the wildest stuff, so
yeah, and so that technology has existed for a while, and so it's basically it creates or provides a platform that regardless of what your motivation is, whether you're nation state, organized crime or a hacktivist or anything in between, that might be a less common use case, but that was definitely something that capability existed along those lines. And so, yeah, we saw a lot of deep fake videos, also audios. We also saw photo manipulation along those lines for purposes of misdis and malinformation and spreading inaccurate information. And so, um, yeah, that genie is definitely out of the bottle along those lines for sure.
well, I talk to a lot of people every day, and still most of them have not seen deep fakes. But it's certainly not just that one incident over in Hong Kong. It's happening more and more every day and growing and certainly getting worse. Um, so any good phishing stories over the years? Anything that stands out as humorous, maybe a great lesson, anything like that?
That's a great question. I don't know about humorous, but a couple of things come to mind. Um, from a phishing story perspective, I would say that a lot of the phishing emails that organizations see oftentimes are cyclical. And so, for example, when I was at Maricopa County, because I haven't frankly been here at ASU this long, so I'll have
Yeah,
to see if we experience something similar. But you could almost set your watch to like every March timeframe, we'd see an influx of IRS tax related phishing
yeah,
campaigns, right? And so, same thing with COVID as well. And so, when COVID had hit, we actually tweaked some of our metrics and we would report on the number of uh, phishing and COVID related based attacks, because it was prime and center for Maricopa County given its role from a public health perspective. So we saw a lot of that. But the other thing that that just came to mind was, um, in previous roles, we would use honey creds. So many of your listeners might be familiar with honey pots, honey mines, that sort of thing. We'd use honey creds. And so oftentimes we'd use those creds after we saw like somebody would report a phishing email pointing to a credential harvesting, a web page or something like that. So we'd feed some honey creds into there, and then we'd track how quickly those creds were leveraged against us. And so at our last job, I think it took less than 10 minutes in one instance to see those creds then try to be repurposed against us. But the interesting thing about that approach is not only were you seeing the speed in which that was occurring, we'd also keep tabs on where they were trying to ingress into the environment. Because if it was more like a spray and pray attack, that was one thing. But if it was more bespoke or focused and trying to gain access to our environment through a particular um, ingress point, then that might be indicative of more of focus attacks, things of that sort. So
Makes
um,
sense.
phishing emails or the byproduct of them can be used to help organizations determine intent, if you will. So, and if nothing else, it makes for interesting feedback and sharing with executive management, the potential impacts of phishing attacks. So,
Oh, no, I think that's brilliant. I like the honey creds idea. Really, I mean, anything we can do to get more information about the attackers, who's targeting us, why is it part of a mass attack, or is it more targeted or sophisticated? I think all those are really great questions. Now, one of the things that I like to talk about is role-based training. I'm a really big advocate of doing more role-based training because I read a study. I mean, I guess I was a big fan of it before, but after I learned that when you can connect training to somebody's role, or really just make it personal in any way, it increases the effectiveness of the training by 15 times. And so for me, I've been a big advocate for a while now of role-based training, but it is a really big project. It's not something that's necessarily easy to do. You're never going to be able to hit all the roles. So, what roles, in your opinion, are the most critical that need to be covered?
oh, that's quite the loaded question, Joshua. So, I think in a lot of instances, it depends on the organization itself, right? What sector does it belong in? What's the makeup of the organization, and things of that sort. So, again, I'll go with my last organization. So, in particular, so well, and I'll give a good example. So, in 2022, we actually did a tabletop exercise based off of insider threats. And so the audience that we picked were very specific and focused towards elections in particular. And so, because one of the things that the county had determined based off of what the security operations team was doing was there was posts on social media about um, the recorder's office looking for part-time employees and volunteers to help with elections. And so
Yeah,
for your listeners who are maybe are not that familiar with elections, at least in this area or this region, it's kind of a lot like city pools, right? So you get a bunch of high school kids to be lifeguards and monitor pools, right? And it's very seasonal, so it ebbs and flows. Same thing with elections. And so every election cycle, the recorder's office would have a call out for part-time employees and volunteers to help. And so we saw a lot of posts on social media encouraging people to apply to get their foot in the door for purposes other than helping out with elections, if you will. And so that coupled with other things, um, we determined that we as an organization needed to be better prepared on potential insider threat and how we would respond. And so to your question, so we involved the executive management at the highest level within the organization. We involved obviously folks from the recorder's office, the information security team. We also had representatives from the state of Arizona Secretary of State's office, things of that sort. And so that might be more of an extreme example of kind of a targeted focus training specifically for those that needed to be prepared along those lines. But then going back maybe a little bit more generically, and so from an email phishing perspective, obviously our senior management, any senior management for any organization is going to be targeted, right? And so
oh, yeah.
essentially those folks on the finance side, that sort of thing. But then also um, anybody who might be trending in social media or traditional media. And so um, I would encourage organizations, regardless of sector, if your organization tends to be in the news, so to speak, and of a certain caliber, that you create almost like a VIP watch list, and then you have training customized to them as well. One other example that comes to mind, Joshua, is again, going back to Maricopa County, we had folks who were employed within the recorder's office that they were getting harassed and threatened on their personal social media accounts. And so we had to create customized training for those individuals, not only how to secure their social media accounts, but also what to post, what not to post. And so, in one specific example, there was a woman who was getting threatened, and her background profile image was that of her family, her husband, and her two kids. And then the threat that came across was not only directed to her, but to her family. And so, our training that we created in house reflected, here's some of the things you might not want to do. You may not want to disclose too much personal information, whether in the form of images, also, you know, specific information about, job duties and or
Yeah.
technology that's being utilized, things of that sort. But a lot of the challenges, if IT folks are doing it, we're not necessarily trained to provide that level of service, and so that takes a village, right? So user experience, learning driven experience, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah, to the point that you made about them, their social profiles. I think that one thing that we don't do a good enough job of as employers is making sure that employees know that the second they update their LinkedIn, they're going to be targeted. I know, we've tracked the time that it takes, sort of like your honey creds, but I guess just a little bit different. How long from the time somebody updates their profile on LinkedIn to the time that the phishing attacks start coming in off of that? And we've seen that happen in as quick as about 10 minutes, the same as you, where, it was crazy. We had a new employee. It was an intern. The intern first day of work, they don't have a ton of work to do. We're getting them onboarded and on the systems and whatever. So they go and they update their LinkedIn. And within just a few minutes, they're being targeted, getting text messages that appeared to be from me. And what impressed me about it was that it was a local number. So they really got every detail along the way. Of course, you will get laughed at Fish Firewall if you come into the boss's office asking about gift cards. But that's just because we're security awareness. Jokes aside, though, that did end up leading to somebody coming to my office asking about gift cards.
mm,
But we had some laughter that day. But I mean, to that point though, gift cards really do still work. I don't know why, but I hear about people falling for these scams almost every day. Now, it's typically not in an office setting or an enterprise setting. That's mostly gone, mostly. But it still works. It still happens, and that tells me we're not doing enough to educate people that there's almost never a legitimate time where somebody's going to ask you to go buy a gift card for them. I've certainly never had that happen in my life, not legitimately anyway. Um, but yeah, I guess I digress there a little bit. But I couldn't agree more. I think your finance people, your people are going to be targeted, your frontline defenders, your executives, all of them need to be trained because they do face threats that the average user maybe doesn't.
yeah, absolutely. The other thing I would add about the training too. So, in addition to being very focused and targeted, right, based off of the role that the individual has, the other aspect of training that I've found works well is also creating training maybe in a corporate or enterprise environment, but is broad enough that and it has enough appeal where the individual will take that information and share that with their friends and family. And so making it personal as well. So on
Yes.
one hand, making it very specific to their job, obviously, to your point, makes them 15 times more likely to absorb that, right? But then conversely, if it's something that is top of mind and it could potentially benefit not only themselves personally, but also their friends and family. I've also seen, I haven't done any numbers or research along these lines, but anecdotally speaking, I've talked to our security champion members who have said, "Oh yeah, this month's training really resonated with us, and we took this back to our family and shared this with et cetera, et cetera." And so
Yeah.
I think there's some of that as well. If that's something that organizations can do, right? Anything to get them interested and thinking that this information is important. So,
I think connecting it to their personal lives is critical, and honestly, I think it's more impactful than even the role-based training. The reason that I think it works better is because that employee, when they go home and they train their wife or their parents or their children about this issue, whatever they learned about that day, they become the expert at home on cybersecurity. And to me, that's the fascinating part about it is because now they've established themselves as the expert. And chances are that's not a one-time role, that it's continuous. And every time they learn a tip at work, they're going to bring it home. And so to me, when you accept that and you're now the expert at home, you have a change in your mental state that is for the positive and of course drives better culture change. So I agree it has to be personal, and I really think that we should encourage employees to get out there, to take it home, to talk to their parents, and even just use that, like, it's amazing. We try to make it all about work, but I found that an email just saying, "Hey, wanted to remind you or let you know about this scam that's targeting elders. Thought you might want to let any elderly family that you have know about this." You're making security front of mind. Sure, it's not directly related to the business, but the impact that it has on the business is significant. And uh, and so I think things like that need to be part of our arsenal, maybe a little bit more.
well, and I would encourage organizations who maybe are trying to reconcile whether it's worth the investment, that even though there seems to be a mandate to return to office, there's still a significant portion of business that at least supports a hybrid approach, right? And so if your employees are more secure at home, then by extension you are going to be more secure from an enterprise perspective as well too. So,
Oh, sorry.
oh,
There we
there
are.
you are.
There we are. Sorry, technical glitches there. But no, I couldn't agree more. And I think that in general, I mean, security awareness, it just needs to be more of a continuous, more of a personal type thing that we can use to make it, just to make it real. I think Hollywood too often makes security awareness or just cybersecurity in general something that is intimidating to the average user. It's this difficult to understand thing. Only a genius can understand it. To me, that's the connotation I get from most of these Hollywood scenes about hacking or cybersecurity. However, I did see one the other day, finally, where somebody's like, "Hey, are we going to go hack?" And they're like, "Yeah, yeah. What's their email address? What are they into?" And the guy's like, "Well, we're just going to send an email." And he's like, "Yeah, that's hacking." um, so I was encouraged. I was like, "Okay, finally, a realistic representation of it." But yeah, I digress. Um, so what's your thought on gamification? So to me, I have mixed emotions on gamification when it comes to security awareness. I think that no one cares about a gold star. So if you do it wrong, I don't think it has a ton of value. But I also noticed a long time ago that too often phishing simulations have these negative, uh, or create these negative experiences for employees. And they think they're getting a raise, they click, they're not getting a raise, and then on top of not getting a raise, uh, they, um, they're in trouble. They're maybe, going through remedial training, or worse, maybe they're even, getting written up, or in some cases, some extreme cases, fired. So I think gamification has the opportunity to take the sting out of it. You can tell people you're gonna fish them. Tell them even what type of fish is gonna come, so they'll be on the lookout for it. And then make it a game of cat and mouse. And to me, I think that's a way to use gamification that's more effective. But that's my opinion. What do you think about gamification?
I think gamification, a lot like our bespoke custom training discussion that we just had a couple minutes ago, um, if done properly, it can be effective. I do think in the context of gamification, I also think it depends on the target audience. And so I think some of your employee base will respond better to gamification than others. And there's different flavors of that too, right? And um, so the example that you provided might fit a certain demographic where you let them know in advance, hey, we are going to be sending out fish. It's going to, and create some sort of incentive sort of program where the first five people that respond get a gift card or something like that. Versus,
Yeah,
in some instances, some portion of your employee base might actually want to have an experience where it's an actual game on their application, right? And that, um, but then that's also a slippery slope in that how long will you retain their attention? And then a lot of that also has to do with the quality and of that gamification experience, if you will, right? Which,
yeah,
frankly, especially for small and medium businesses, unless they're willing to invest in a third party to provide that, most don't have the resources to pull that off successfully, right? So then you have to figure out what you can do with the resources that you have available to it. And so um, we've tried different I've tried different aspects of gamification to a certain degree, and I wouldn't call it gamification per se, but probably one of the most positive experiences we had at my last job was we had a security champions program. And so that was a scenario where we were trying to build cybersecurity culture from the top, middle, and bottom, if you will, the organization simultaneously, as opposed to having upper management just try to, ram it down people's throats. That works only to a certain degree, right? As opposed to fully embracing cybersecurity as a business enabler and how everybody's job and responsibility is at. But I think one of the most successful, and might have gamification elements associated with it, but we had our security champions for their monthly meeting, and instead of meeting on teams like normal, we actually had them participate as observers. On my security operations team, they conducted a tabletop exercise, which they did every month, and they would go through different scenarios. They'd up As a result, they'd practice their readiness for a particular attack type. They'd update their incident response playbooks as appropriate based off of the findings of the tabletop exercise, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a virtual warfare range, if you will. And so they all got to participate and observe the ops team go through that. And then me and my deputy CISO at the time, we curated the conversation, and we would explain why they were doing what they were doing and how they were practicing and how we had experienced some similar types of attacks in the past. And that, from an education perspective, really, we got a lot of mileage out of that. And so not only did they understand why we were doing what we were doing, and that they also appreciated the fact that we were practicing all that, and then that would get taken back, and I know for a fact that got shared widely within their respective departments, right? And so maybe not so much the traditional gamification approach, but the I think the impact is similar in nature, and that I guess the gamification would be in terms of like the digital warfare range that my ops
Yeah.
team used, right? But then we expanded the audience to include individuals to kind of help share the message and kind of continue to build that culture. So that was maybe more of a unique approach that we took that really uh, paid dividends.
Well, first of all, I love the security champions approach. I think everybody should do it. It's one of those things that doesn't cost money, sort of like hardening. It's,
Hmm.
it doesn't cost you a ton of money to go harden those systems and deploy those, more you know, hardened configurations. So I think the security champions thing is great. And to that point, when I think of gamification, I don't necessarily think of the traditional approaches or even the games. To me, I think of having that leaderboard and, pinning the different departments against each other and then using that to create those security champions off of those departments. To me, that's where I really see gamification, and I don't think it has to be so complex. Sometimes it's the simple that works the best. I mean, take AI, take deepfakes. It's none of these fancy tools that work the best to prevent us from falling victim to them. It's process and procedure that works better than anything else. So let's talk about phishing simulations. What are your thoughts on them, and what sort of methodologies do you run around those?
Um, I definitely think they have a role and they are effective if employed properly. I do think as organizations use phishing simulations over time, that and there's been research done along these lines that you will see certain aspects of end user response improve, but then you will see other aspects that will degrade over time. And so, what I mean is, this is my third stint as a CISO. And so, in my two previous organizations, once we employed, regular phishing campaigns and testing the end users, over time, we saw that their ability to recognize and spot phishing emails improved for sure. Um, and that even over an extended period of time, we'd get a little bit more, I guess, complicated for lack of a better description. So probably my favorite one that comes to mind was receiving the email notifications about, oh, the multifunction device scanner just sent you an email, right, with your scanned image, right? That one got a lot of people.
Oh, I'll bet it
Um,
did.
yeah, but very very pertinent one for our organization at the time. But then one of the things in both my previous jobs that I noticed was as the end user's ability to spot fish improved, their reporting rate dropped. And so and so
Reporting of phishing.
yeah, and so they just got to the point where they got so good at finding and identifying the fish that they just ignored it as opposed to um and then they just started getting accustomed to being able to spot it and then not take the next step, which was reporting it. So we had to rejigger in both of those instances our approach and our messaging to the employees to say, hey, you guys are doing great in spotting fish. We have the data to show that, and we share that information with our governance, our champions, et cetera, et cetera. However, part of what we depend on all of you to do is still let us know when you see these fish. Just because
Yeah.
you caught it doesn't mean everybody else is going to catch it with equal facility, right? And so that's a trend that I've noticed from my two previous jobs was over an extended period of time, and it usually takes, at least my recollection, it would take at least a year, if not slightly longer, to see that trend. But inevitably, at least in the two last positions I was in with the two previous organizations, phishing identification improved, but then over time the reporting would dip down, and so just trying to reinforce that. So
I have a hypothesis about why that might have happened. because I've seen the same thing, and we actually took some steps to counteract that.
Mhm.
But I've absolutely seen the same thing, and my hypothesis as to why is because when we run simulations, we want them to have that hands-on experience to learn. Well, the more they learn about these different tactics that the bad guys use, like urgency, the more likely they are to spot it at a more of a subconscious level. It becomes second nature. And the hypothesis is because we've seen people that have said, "Well, I never got that fish." We used to say, "Congrats" every time they didn't click, and then we'd have the occasional person who'd be like, "Well, I never saw that." And what we realized was that because it was at a subconscious level, they were deleting the message and moving on without ever even processing it consciously. It was just a subconscious thing. And so that's my theory as to why that happens. But I think there's ways you can mitigate it. And the number one just being kudos. Every time somebody does something right, praise them.
Mhm.
Tell them how awesome they're doing, particularly around phishing. Call them a cyber hero, because that's what we want is for them to report. And so praising them when they do report helps to, just I guess reaffirm that good behavior that we're looking for.
Yeah. One thing that we've done through previous governance as well as the cybersecurity champions program was we'll take a particular persnickety like phishing email, right, that people would report, and then we would follow up with, because of that report, this is how we were able to handle this particular situation. And turned out, oh, it had a malicious payload, but we were able to get in front of it, blah blah blah. And so being able to demonstrate what their role was in the kill chain, so to speak, right, in this particular instance, which then also by extension reinforces this concept of cybersecurity is everybody's job, right? And this
Yeah.
is how you affected that positive outcome as a result, right? And so examples like that, if they make it like we were talking about earlier with training, right? If you can make it personal to them and how they had a material impact on that, then it tends to build that into their behavior moving forward, right?
Yeah.
And or they may even go share with their employees, hey, or coworkers, hey, I reported this, and this is what the information security team was able to do as a result. So yeah.
Yeah. No, we want them to be proud. We want them, essentially figuratively putting that report card up on their cubicle.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time here today. Any sort of last bits of advice before we wrap the show?
Kind of going back to maybe how we started our conversation, Joshua, was um and this tends to be a theme on at least presentations I've given here recently, which is, for organizations that maybe have a bunch of skeletons in their closet, aka things like asset management, treating data as an asset, or
Windows XP machines.
yeah, yeah, legacy, technical debt, et cetera, et cetera. Um, the advent of this new technology that we're dealing with, whether it's AI, whether it's accelerated adoption of cloud services, et cetera, isn't necessarily, those problems aren't going to go away. In a lot of instances, those problems are only going to be exacerbated. And so the sooner that organizations can get their arms around those, the better off they're going to be, and be better positioned to leverage this newer technology for a positive net outcome as opposed to increasing your risk profile, so to speak. So
I like it. That's great advice. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for another episode of Fishing for Answers. As always, be sure and be secure.